Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. The kitchen was the warmest room in the farmhouse, and it had been the warmest room for as long as anyone could remember. The black iron stove stood against the far wall like an old patient guardian, its belly full of slow-burning wood, its surface radiating a heat so steady and deep that it seemed less like warmth and more like a presence, something alive and attentive, breathing its gentle breath into every corner of the room. The windows were rimed with frost, the panes etched in white filigree by the cold that pressed in from the fields beyond. But inside the kitchen, the air was golden. It was thick with the scent of honey and the faint sweet ghost of cinnamon, and beneath that, the older smell of the wood of the work table, the linseed oil worked into the floorboards over decades, the particular dusty warmth of a room that has held many winters. Elara moved through the kitchen the way she moved through all the hours of her life now, slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has long since made her peace with time. She was 63 years old, and her hands, which had once moved quickly and often with the impatient energy of youth, had grown to understand that the best things required patience. The bread she baked rose on its own schedule. The preserves she made in Somerset according to their own mysterious laws. The kitchen itself, old and warm and deeply familiar, seemed to operate by a different measure of time than the world outside, and she had learned to move within it accordingly. She had pulled her hair back loosely, and she wore her grandmother's apron, the one with the faded blue stripe along the hem, its strings tied twice around her waist. It was not a conscious choice to wear it, or rather, it was a choice so habitual that it had ceased to be a choice at all. She reached for it each morning from the hook beside the door, as naturally as she reached for her cup, and each morning it settled around her like a familiar embrace. She did not think about the apron as she tied it. She did not think about whose hands had tied it before hers. She simply tied it and moved to the work table and began. The blue ceramic bowl sat on the work table where she had left it the evening before, turned upside down over the cloth she used to protect the wood. It had a small chip on its inner rim, just there at the place where the curve deepened, a chip that had been there as long as she could remember, a chip she had pressed her thumb against 1,000 times, tracing its smooth edge the way one traces a familiar scar. The bowl had belonged to her grandmother, and before that, she supposed, to someone else entirely, though she could not have said who. It was simply the bowl. It had always been the bowl. Its glaze was the deep, quiet blue of a winter sky at the hour just before dark, and its weight in her hands was the weight of something that had been used and loved and made smooth by years of use. She set it right side, up on the work table, and reached for the flour canister. The wooden spoon rested across the top of the bowl. She had left it there too, as she always did, cleaned and dried and waiting. The spoon was old beyond her ability to precisely reckon. Its handle had been dark once, she thought, some warmer shade of wood, but the years had worn it to a pale, silvery smoothness, and the bowl of the spoon itself had a slight asymmetry from decades of stirring, as though the wood had slowly conformed to the motion of the wrist that drove it. She picked it up now and held it for a moment without thinking, her thumb running along the handle as it always did, feeling the worn grooves and the silky smooth places, and the single small crack near the top that had been there. For as long as she had known the spoon, the wood was cold from the night, but it would warm quickly. Everything in this kitchen warmed quickly. She measured the flour with the same tin cup her grandmother had used, leveling the top with the back of a knife as she had been taught. 2 cups, then a third, the flour sifting down into the blue bowl with a sound like the softest breath, piling gently, making a small mountain of white that she regarded for a moment before reaching for the salt, a pinch of salt, then the baking powder, each measured into the bowl with the small silver spoon she kept in a jar by the canisters. She added the spices last, first the cinnamon, which fell in a slow rust-red drift that scented the air immediately, then the ginger, then the nutmeg, just a scrape of the whole nut against the old grater, the smell of it sharp and sweet and slightly warm in her nostrils. She stirred the dry ingredients together with the wooden spoon, turning the mixture over and over in the bowl until the spices disappeared into the flour and the whole thing took on the faintest warm colour like the light at the edge of the stove. The butter she had taken from the cold larder earlier and left to soften on the work table, and it was ready now, yielding to the touch, but still cool, still holding its shape loosely. She cut it into the flour with her fingertips, working quickly but gently, breaking it apart into smaller and smaller pieces until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs, the butter distributed evenly throughout, the whole thing slightly clumped and fragrant. Her hands worked without instruction. She did not need to think about this. Her hands knew what they were doing. They had done it so many times that the knowledge had passed from thought into the body, into the tips of her fingers, into the muscles of her palms. And now it lived there, available and certain like breathing. She cracked the eggs into a smaller bowl and beat them lightly with a fork, watching the yolks break and bleed their deep gold into the whites, watching the mixture become uniform and faintly frothy. She added the milk, just a little, and beat again. Then she made a well in the flour mixture, poured in the eggs and milk, and began to stir with the wooden spoon, pulling the flour in from the edges, watching the dough come together slowly, the dry and the wet combining into something new and unified, the spoon scraping against the bottom of the bowl in that familiar low sound, soft and rhythmic, almost like a voice. But the honey was still to come. The honey was the heart of the cake. It was what made it her grandmother's cake, and not simply any honey cake from any kitchen in the world. The honey came from the hives her grandmother had kept at the far end of the kitchen garden, and though the hives had been gone for 30 years now, she still sourced her honey from the same family that had taken them over, the martens, whose bees ranged over the same meadows and filled their combs with the same flowers, and whose honey tasted to her particular palate of the same particular sweetness she remembered from childhood. She kept the honey in a tall, heavy jar on the high shelf above the work table, the shelf her grandmother had used for the same purpose, the shelf that required her to stand on her toes to reach. She set down the wooden spoon. She stretched upward, her fingertips reaching for the jar, and found it, the cool, heavy glass, the slightly sticky surface of the lid. She closed her hand around it and drew it carefully forward along the shelf, and as she did, her fingers touched something else, a slight resistance, a small, papery obstacle tucked behind the jar. She paused. She set the honey jar on the work table and looked up at the shelf. Tucked against the back of the shelf, half, hidden in the slight shadow where the shelf met the wall, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed, deeply, evenly yellowed, the colour of old linen or the pages of a book left in the sun for a summer. She reached up again and took it carefully between two fingers, drawing it down with the delicacy she might use for something fragile, which she supposed it was. She stood at the work table with the folded paper in one hand and the jar of honey on the surface before her, and she looked at the paper for a long moment without opening it. It was small, no larger than a playing card when folded, and folded twice, so that it made a small, neat square. The fold lines were sharp and deliberate. Whoever had folded it carefully with intention. The paper itself felt thin and slightly brittle between her fingers, not fragile enough to tear with ordinary handling, but old enough that she held it gently without thinking. She turned it over. The outer surface was blank. She set it on the work table beside the honey jar and unfolded it once. Then again it opened into a small rectangle, and she smoothed it flat against the work table with the edge of her hand, and read what was written there. The handwriting was her grandmother's. She knew it without question, without a moment of doubt. She had grown up with that handwriting, on the labels of jam jars, on the receipts tucked into recipe books, on the birthday cards that had arrived each year with a regularity and a warmth that had seemed, in childhood, as natural and inevitable as the seasons. The letters were tall and slightly forward-leaning, elegant in a way that spoke of another era's idea of penmanship, with a flourish on the capital letters that her grandmother had never entirely shed, even in old age. The ink was faded to a brownish grey, but the words were clear. There was only one sentence. Elara stood at the work table and read the words. She read them again. She stood very still for a long moment, the note flat on the work table before her, the wooden spoon resting in the bowl of dough, the honey jar gleaming in the pale winter light that fell through the frost. Rimed windows, the fire crackled once in the belly of the black stove somewhere in the house. The old clock on the mantelpiece ticked its slow, unhurried tick. Outside, the snow fell without a sound. She picked up the wooden spoon with one hand and held the note with the other, and she breathed in slowly through her nose, filling her lungs with the warm, sweet air of the kitchen. Honey, cinnamon, butter, wood smoke, and let the breath out again long and steady, until she felt the tension she had not known she was holding begin to ease from her shoulders, from the small of her back, from the fine muscles around her eyes. She carried the note to the table and sat down. Not the work table where the dough waited, but the kitchen table, the smaller, rounder one set beneath the window, the one with the two chairs that faced the snowy garden. She had sat at this table her whole life as a child, eating breakfast while her grandmother moved about the kitchen, as a young woman drinking tea and reading on quiet Sunday mornings. Now alone in the deep winter of an afternoon that had no particular urgency to it, her hands folded in her lap, and the note before her on the scrubbed pine surface, she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother had been a tall woman, taller than Elara, with the kind of bearing that made rooms feel organized around her without any effort on her part. She had white hair for as long as Elara could remember, white and thick and pinned up each morning, with a severity that softened over the course of the day, until by evening it was loose and wavy around her face. She had large, capable hands, hands that could coax bread into being and jar 40 pounds of plum preserves in a single August afternoon, and knead a shoulder that ached, all with the same unhurried competence. She had not been a demonstrative woman in the way that some grandmothers are, not a woman of many embraces or loud endearments, but her love had been as steady and unmistakable as the heat from the black stove, and Elara had never once doubted it. It was her grandmother who had taught her to bake, not with formal lessons or written instructions, but by proximity, by letting a small girl stand beside her at the work table on cold mornings, watching the flour fall into the blue ceramic bowl, watching the honey drizzle in a slow amber thread from the jar, watching the dough yield to the particular motion of the wooden spoon. She had let Elara stir when the stirring was done. The last turns of the spoon before the dough went into the tin, and she had let her lick the honey from the spoon after, which was a pleasure Elara could still taste if she thought about it carefully enough. The faint warmth of the wood, the thick floral sweetness of the honey, the slight resistance of the spoon against her tongue. You can always tell when it is ready. Her grandmother had told her once, by the way it feels when the dough stops fighting you. It is ready. She had been perhaps 8 years old at the time, and she had not fully understood, and her grandmother had not explained further. It was the kind of teaching that deposited itself like a seed and grew slowly over years, and she had understood it completely by the time she was 30, when she had been kneading dough of her own in her own kitchen, and had felt, quite suddenly and for the first time, the exact moment when the dough changed beneath her hands, when it went from a reluctant, sticky mass to something yielding and elastic and almost alive, and she had thought, "Ah, that is what she meant." Her grandmother had died when Elara was in her late 30s, and the farmhouse had passed to her mother, and then to Elara herself when her mother died 10 years ago. Her mother had been a different sort of woman in the kitchen, a less frequent presence there, a woman whose life had moved in other directions, who had baked when the occasion called for it, but did not bake as a daily rhythm the way her own mother had. But she had always used the same spoon. Elara remembered that now, watching the snow fall outside the kitchen window, the note lying quietly on the table before her, her mother standing at the work table on the occasions when she did bake, reaching automatically for the wooden spoon, as though there were no question of using anything else, as though the spoon were simply the spoon, the obvious and only instrument for the purpose. Her mother had never known about the note. Elara was certain of that. Her mother would have said something, would have shown her, or spoken of it, or tucked it somewhere more prominent. Her mother had not been a woman for private mysteries. If she had found a note from her mother tucked behind the honey jar, She would have put it in a frame, or pressed it in the family Bible, or held it up at dinner and read it aloud with tears in her eyes. She was not the one the note was for. The note had waited, tucked against the back of the high shelf, through all the years of her mother's tenure in this kitchen, patient as the wood of the shelf itself, patient as the honey in its jar, waiting for the hands that would find it. Elara set the spoon down on the table beside the note and smoothed the paper with the tips of her fingers. The ink was faded, but the words were there, for the one who still uses my spoon. She turned the sentence over in her mind slowly, the way one turns a smooth stone over in the palm, feeling its contours, its weight. Her grandmother had written this, knowing that it might not be found for years, knowing that it might be found by anyone, by her daughter, by Elara herself, by some future person she could not have imagined. She had written it knowing that the person who found it would be the one who had kept the practice alive, who had reached for the wooden spoon day after day, year after year, choosing to use the old thing rather than a newer one, who had kept the blue bowl and the tin canister and the high shelf for the honey jar, who had continued to bake the honey cake in this kitchen as though it were a responsibility, which perhaps it was. She had written it as a gift for that person, whoever they turned out to be, across whatever distance of years the note had to travel. She had turned out to be Elara, not her mother, who had loved the kitchen but lived elsewhere in spirit, not some hypothetical grandchild Elara had not had. Elara, who had come back to this farmhouse in her 40s, when her mother's health began to fail, who had settled into it the way water settles into the shape of its container, gradually, completely without drama, and who had found in its rooms a life that suited her in ways she had not expected. Elara, who baked every week through the winter, who kept the blue ceramic bowl washed and dried on the work table where it had always been, who tied on the apron with the blue stripe without thinking about it, who reached as naturally as breathing for the wooden spoon. She had not known she was being watched. She had not known she was being held in her grandmother's regard across the years, that the old woman had anticipated her somehow, or anticipated someone like her, someone who would love this kitchen in the way it deserved to be loved, who would continue what had been started here long before Elara was born. There was something in that recognition, in being seen by someone who had been dead for more than 20 years, seen and named and addressed, that moved through her now like the warmth from the stove, slow and deep and settling. She did not cry. It was not that sort of feeling, or rather, it was larger than the sort of feeling that resolves itself in tears. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door opening onto a room you had always known was there, but had never quite found the entrance to. A room that was warm and familiar and smelled of honey, that had been waiting for you all along. She sat at the kitchen table for a little while longer, the note before her on the pine surface, the snow falling past the window, the fire ticking in the stove. She did not feel the need to do anything with what she felt. She did not want to speak it aloud, or write it down, or tell anyone. The note was not that kind of message. It was not an announcement or a declaration or a revelation requiring response. It was simply an acknowledgement, a grandmother's quiet word of recognition, placed where it would be found by the right hands and no other. It required nothing of her. It asked for no reply. It simply was, as the wooden spoon simply was, as the blue ceramic bowl with its small chip simply was, a presence, a continuation, a thing passed from hand to hand. She folded the paper carefully, following the original fold lines, pressing each crease with the edge of her thumbnail until the small square was neat and tight, as it had been when she found it. She reached into the pocket of the apron, her grandmother's apron, the one with the faded blue stripe, and tucked the paper inside. She felt it settle against the fabric, small and light and warm, and she pressed her hand flat against her apron for just a moment, feeling the note beneath her palm. Then she rose from the table and went back to the work table and the waiting dough. The honey drizzled slowly from the jar when she tipped it, amber and viscous, catching the pale winter light, winding itself down into the bowl in a slow, deliberate stream. She watched it fall without hurrying it. There was no hurrying honey. She added it in 2 portions, stirring after each, working the sweetness through the dough with the wooden spoon in the same slow circles her grandmother had made, the same circles her mother had made on the occasions she had baked, the same circles Elara herself had made for 20 years in this kitchen. The spoon scraped gently against the bottom of the blue bowl. The dough yielded to its passage, taking up the honey, growing darker and more fragrant and more unified with each turn. The oven breathed its warmth when she opened the door to check its temperature. A deep, dry heat that smelled faintly of the morning's bread, and beneath that, of decades of use. She judged the heat with her palm held near the opening, a practice her grandmother had taught her long before she had understood enough to articulate what she was measuring. The oven was ready. She greased the tin with butter, working it into the corners and up the sides, and then she poured the batter in. It came out thick and slow and golden, and she scraped the last of it from the bowl with the wooden spoon and smoothed the top with the back of a spoon until it was even. She opened the oven door and slid the tin inside and closed the door again. The kitchen settled around her in the way it always did once the cake was in the oven. A particular quality of waiting, of quiet attention, as though the room itself were listening for the first signs of the baking, the slow thickening of the air, the deepening sweetness of the scent, the faint sound of the batter beginning to work in the heat. She washed the bowl first, filling it with warm water and leaving it to soak while she cleaned the work table, wiping the flour from its surface with a damp cloth, gathering the scattered spice, tidying the canisters back into their proper places. Then she washed the spoon. She washed it as she always washed it, carefully, without submerging it for long, drying it immediately with a clean cloth, running the cloth along the worn handle and around the smooth bowl of the spoon until it was entirely dry. Wet wood could crack. The spoon had survived this long because someone had always taken care of it. She set it in its place on the counter beside the work table, in the shallow ceramic dish where it always rested, its handle propped against the rim, its bowl tipped slightly upward. She looked at it for a moment before she turned away. She sat by the window, then in the chair that caught the afternoon light and faced the snow-covered kitchen garden and the white fields beyond. The snow was still falling, fine and steady without wind, settling on the branches of the apple trees in the garden and on the stone wall at its far edge and on the frozen surface of the small pond beyond the wall. Everything outside was white and still and very quiet. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The smell of the baking cake was beginning now. A warm, honey-sweet rising fragrance that moved through the room like a gentle announcement, deepening with each passing minute, richer and darker, and more complex as the heat worked its transformation in the tin. She did not read. She did not think particularly. She sat in the chair with her hands in her lap, one hand resting lightly over the apron pocket where the note lay, and she watched the snow fall and listened to the sounds of the kitchen, the slow, deep breathing of the stove, the occasional soft creak of the old house settling in the cold, the faint tick of the clock from the front room, the muffled whisper of the snow against the glass. These were the sounds she had listened to all her life in this kitchen, and they were the same sounds that had been here before her when other women had sat in this chair or stood at this work table doing what she was doing now, waiting for the cake to finish. She thought of her grandmother's hands. She thought of them as she remembered them from childhood, large and capable and always warm, always slightly work. Roughened the knuckles a little stiff in cold weather. She thought of the way those hands had moved through this kitchen, with the same unhurried certainty she tried to bring to her own movements. Now the same deep familiarity, the same quiet knowledge that everything in this room had its place and its purpose and its proper time. She thought of her mother's hands, which had been smaller and more fine-boned, which had moved more quickly and with more nervous energy, but which had reached for the wooden spoon with the same natural ease. 3 pairs of hands on the same worn handle, 3 women in the same kitchen, making the same cake, breathing the same sweet, warm air. The afternoon light was fading by the time the cake was done. She could tell without looking at the clock the quality of the light through the frost. Rimed windows had shifted from the flat white light of midday to something softer and more amber, and the kitchen had grown perceptibly darker at its far edges, while remaining warm and bright near the stove. She opened the oven and tested the cake with a thin knife. It came out clean, and she took the tin out and set it on the rack on the counter, and stood over it for a moment, looking at its golden brown surface, breathing in the full heat of its fragrance, which was close and warm and entirely itself now, not just honey and cinnamon and butter, but something that those things had become together in the heat, something more than their sum. She left it to cool. She washed the last of the dishes and wiped down the stove and hung the damp cloth on its hook. And then she swept the kitchen floor with the old broom that had lived in the corner, beside the larder door for longer than she could remember, pushing the flour dust and the crumbs of dough across the smooth boards and out into the back hallway. She worked slowly and without rush, the broom's soft bristles whispering across the floor, the cake cooling on the counter, the snow falling beyond the window. When she was done, she put the broom back in its corner and stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, looking at it in the fading light, everything in its place, the blue bowl upside, down on the cloth, the wooden spoon in its ceramic dish, the honey jar back on the high shelf, the cake on the rack, the apron on her body, the note in her pocket. The cake was cool enough by the time the light had almost entirely gone, the windows dark now and reflecting the warm interior of the kitchen back at her, the snow beyond them invisible. She cut a slice, not a large one, and put it on a plate, and carried it to the chair by the window and sat down with it in her lap. She did not turn on the lamp. She sat in the near, dark of the kitchen, the fire in the stove the warmest light, and she looked at the slice of cake on its plate, its cut surface showing the dense golden interior, the slight gleam of the honey that ran through it. She lifted the fork. She took the first bite. She closed her eyes. The taste was the same as it had always been. It was the same as it had been the first time she had eaten this cake, as a small child at this very table, the same as it had been every winter since, through all the years of her girlhood and her adulthood and her middle age, and into this quiet, settled later chapter of her life. It was honey and cinnamon, and the slight warmth of ginger and the richness of butter, and beneath all of that, below the identifiable flavors, something else, something that was not quite a taste but a quality, a kind of warmth that spread through the chest and down into the hands, the particular warmth of a thing made in a warm kitchen, by warm hands for no other purpose than the simple, patient giving of sweetness. Her grandmother was there, not in any way that required explaining or defending or being careful about, simply there, in the honey and in the spoon that had stirred it in the small square of paper folded against her heart, in the worn handle of the spoon resting in its dish on the counter, in the blue bowl and the black stove and the frost-rimed windows and the falling snow, there in the recipe that had passed wordlessly from hand to hand across 3 generations, depositing itself in the body's knowledge rather than on the page. There in the apron Elara wore, and in the apron's pocket, and in the single sentence that had waited, patient as the kitchen itself, for the right pair of hands to find it. She ate the cake slowly, in the near, dark, while the snow fell outside, and the fire burned low in the stove, and the old house settled around her, creaking once, quietly, like a long, slow breath. She tasted each bite the way she tasted everything she made in this kitchen, with attention, with gratitude, with the particular fullness of someone who has been given something they did not know they needed. The sweetness deepened, and then resolved as she swallowed the last bite, and set the fork on the plate, and she sat for a while longer without moving, her hand resting on the apron pocket over the note, the kitchen growing slowly darker and warmer, and more still around her. She was not alone. She had not been alone for a long time, though she lived here by herself in this farmhouse, where the cold pressed against the windows and the stove kept its faithful warmth, and the wooden spoon rested in its dish beside the work table. She was accompanied by the women who had stood at this work table before her, who had measured and stirred and waited and tasted, who had tied this apron and reached for this spoon and lifted this jar of honey from the high shelf, who had lived their particular lives in this particular kitchen and left behind them, in the wood and the glass and the worn ceramic and the faded ink, the accumulated warmth of all their days. She was accompanied by the note in her pocket, small and light as a feather, as present as a hand laid gently on her shoulder. The kitchen held its generations. The snow fell beyond the dark window, the fire breathed its warmth, and Elara sat in her grandmother's kitchen, in her grandmother's apron, the note folded against her heart, and was still.